Everybody, thanks so much for joining today. My name is Brian Zawada, and with Jim Kastle, we'll be presenting There's No Business Resilience Without Cyber Resilience. Just a little bit of background or some logistics. Number one, everybody is muted. There is on the right side of your screen a panel with 3 tabs. One says chat, one says poll, one says handouts. Feel free at any point along the way to put any comments or questions in the chat panel, and at the end, Jim and I will address your questions. And if we're monitoring, if anything comes up that's pertinent to what we're talking about specifically, we'll try to bring that up then. We will be sharing the presentation slides afterward, so no need to bring that one up, but that will be sent out by the organizers after. And we're also going to have a number of polls in the course of our presentation, just to get a chance to get to know you a little bit better, some of your thoughts and ideas and things that Jim and I can react to along the way. So with that being said, we'll just go through a little bit of introductions here. Again, my name is Brian Zawada. I'm the Vice President and General Manager of the Resilience Business at Riskonnect. And I'll introduce Riskonnect here a little bit further in just a moment. But by way of background, I've been in the resilience space for upwards of around 30 years now, helping organizations across a wide range of different topics. And one of the things I'll say is that over the last 5 to 5+ years now, if organizations aren't bringing up cyber as part of the work that I'm doing with them, it's utterly shocking. And in many cases, it's the trigger for getting started or reaching a higher level of maturity. So with that, that's a little bit about me. I'll ask Jim to introduce himself, but before doing so, a little fun fact, gosh, it's probably been now 31 years ago. I was actually an intern for Jim when we were working together in the military, and his branch of service is slightly tipped off by what's behind his head. But Jim, go ahead and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I agree with Brian's comments about cyber is the topic. It's certainly the topic at board meetings. I've seen it throughout my career. So I'm obviously the Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO at Kimberly-Clark. I've just landed on 3-year anniversary. It's my 6th opportunity to be a CISO across industry verticals. So it's been a great opportunity, and it's a great opportunity to be part of this webinar and certainly this topic. And I've already noticed that we've got Bangalore on the line, and so it says good morning. It's a very early morning, so it's great to see an international audience.
Great. Again, thanks so much for being here, Jim. I think your perspective will be really helpful for the audience. So as I mentioned, we're going to do some polls. And so what I'd like to do here is ask Jeff to go ahead and trigger our first poll. And this is mainly just to get a chance for Jim and I to get to know you a little bit better and who's joining us in this webinar. So poll is, what's the focus of your current role? We only gave you 3 options here. Is it primarily business continuity, primarily information security, or other? And Jim, as those are coming in, we'll give everybody a few seconds to answer. If you can kind of.
Yep, I'm tracking that right now. I did see one chat that they weren't seeing the screen. I don't know if that's been resolved. So just for the folks who work in the back office here, we've got 106 answers already. Now it's approaching even a lot more. And right now it looks like primarily business continuity. So it's and then a split between information security and other. So I've given another couple of seconds here, Brian, but we're approaching 130 answers, which is pretty impressive. But the preponderance of the audience certainly looks like it's primarily business continuity, which I think is great. But I'm also, as a CISO, I'm a little bit concerned about the lack of information security professionals on this call, because these topics and these issues are shared across our teams, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just a CISO, not just business continuity. It's definitely something that's not only industry-wide, but across our business units as well.
You bet. All right. Well, good. Well, that gives us a little understanding of kind of where we can focus some of our attention here. And again, as I mentioned before, I work for a company called Riskonnect, who's sponsoring this webinar. And we focus on integrated risk management. You can see in the circle over there on the left, gives you an overview of some of the work that we do in terms of insurable risk in that green colored area. The blue areas are governance, risk, and compliance. And then, of course, we've highlighted business continuity and resilience in the sub-elements there as well. But we have about 2,500 customers really all over the world, about 1,100 people serving those customers. And again, across a broad range of integrated risk management efforts. Some of you may not be familiar with Riskonnect, but probably are familiar with many of our legacy organizations. And this little short timeline gives you an overview of the different companies that came together before joining Riskonnect. And that included back in 2019, Clearview, primarily based in the UK, and Assurance, which was carved out of SunGard. And then in 2020, Evolution Consulting, which is the organization that I came from, joined with the other two. And in 2020, we became rebranded as Castellon. And then 2 years later, joined Riskonnect to kind of close out, or at least help fill in a gap in its portfolio of integrated risk management focused on business continuity and resilience. So what are we going to talk about today? Number one, Jim and I have had a lot of conversations and have worked together in the past, and he continues to mentor me as it relates to cyber issues and information security. He's always been a great sounding board. And that was the genesis of this conversation, was let's talk a little bit and have more of a conversational type approach, less PowerPoint, and talk about some of the issues that I think are facing each of our disciplines, that being business continuity, information security, and cyber. So we'll talk about some of the key outcomes of working together. We'll talk about really how's the relationship supposed to work? What's the ideal coordination between information security and business continuity, all focused on delivering cyber resilience, which we're going to define. And then we'll talk about who's oftentimes involved in that journey on cyber resilience. You'll hear us talk a lot about that in our commentary. And then some of the key processes that contribute to greater cyber resilience maturity.
Yeah, I would just add a comment that I'm seeing in the chat, Brian, which I think is relevant. Someone made a comment that, risk crosses multiple domains, but it's not uniquely either. And I think they mean it's not uniquely the CISO or the business continuity. I think it's fair. I think just to set the stage, risk management is an enterprise function. It's a responsibility of everyone, right? There's risks that are unique to a particular business domain or business function that you would expect that business function to help manage. So I agree. I think it's a good comment. I think it was from Eric. Risk is an enterprise function.
You bet. You bet. All right, so what we'll do here from an agenda perspective, I mentioned we'll have a couple other polls sprinkled in here, but we'll start off with some definitions. We'll talk about roles and responsibilities. And then Jim and I are going to have a conversation about what does good look like when it comes to this enterprise risk function. We'll talk about some common issues or roadblocks, pitfalls that people are up against, some misperceptions even. And then we'll conclude with kind of a summary of some of the good attributes around cyber resilience. And then we'll have some time there for Q&A. All right, so let's do this. We'll open up the second poll at this point. And the poll is going to be perhaps maybe a loaded question. And again, Jim, I'll kind of ask you to give the kind of the live commentary, but information security and cyber resilience are synonymous. True or false? So just take a look at that for a second, give that just a moment. And we wanted to kind of see where everybody's head's at, especially since we have a good deal of people here that are in the business continuity space, because we wanted to kind of see where your starting point is, and then we'll certainly comment on this as we go. All right, Jim, what are you seeing there?
So it's here on the second poll here. It looks like it's interesting, actually. It's not a 50-50 split, but it's about 140 answers. 65% say it's false, 35% say it's true, plus or minus. It's a little bit variable, but that's interesting. I'm actually, I found that a very interesting set of responses there.
Good. So, well, I think our next three discussion topics here will hopefully kind of illuminate at least our personal thoughts on the matter, and then we'll kind of react to that 65-35 split.
I love that. I'll just say another comment. A few people are still saying they're only seeing the blue screen. So again, we worked out on the background, but I think enough people are dialed in. So
okay, all right. So let's go ahead and take a look here at backgrounds and definitions. I mentioned that just to get everybody kind of set the stage or set a foundation for everybody. Number one, I'm going to share my thoughts on a definition of business continuity. I'm not going to, read off anything that might be in, from a DRI perspective or an ISO perspective. But I think of business continuity as really intentionally positioning the organization to meet stakeholder expectations, regardless of what is thrown at it. And when I mean regardless of what's thrown at it, any type of threat, any type of issue that really could interrupt the go-to-market strategy. It could interrupt the experience the customer has with the organization's products and services. It might impact if it's really big or you're a major player, impact the marketplace. And the key here is that really all forms of threats are in scope, and it would interrupt the organization's normal business as usual capability to respond. And so if we use that as kind of the backdrop for business continuity, Jim, do you want to kind of give your thoughts on how we might define information security? And then, of course, we'll bring up cyber resilience and kind of comment on that as well.
Yeah, like you, I'm not going to pull a predefined definition from either NIST or DHS. From my perspective, it's a control environment to help mitigate risks that can eventuate in the cyberspace, right? And help mitigate compromise, not just a risk, but also mitigate a compromise, whether it's, IP theft, it could be privacy related, it could be a number of things, it could be ransomware. It's a huge, and to your point about business continuity, information security is kind of a catch-all. But to me, it's basically, if you're working information security, you're establishing a control environment to help mitigate the risks that are out there, new, evolving, et cetera.
Yep, absolutely. And Jim, I'm gonna ask you to do the same thing again here from a cyber resilience perspective. And while you're talking about that, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to restart just in case anybody else is still having problems. So you'll be able to hear, everybody will be able to hear you, but I'm just going to flick the screen here one time and get it to stop and start again.
Okay, perfect. So, from my perspective, cyber resilience, there's a lot of similarities between defining cyber resilience and information security. I think cyber resilience are mitigations to prevent or manage interruptions that could occur due to a cyber event that can impact business operations. But I also think it includes a plan to either continue operations or otherwise resume operations if a disruption actually occurs. Let me just add that, and Brian and I did talk about this, we've talked about this over the years. I want to make sure everybody's clear. Cyber resilience is not the domain of the CISO. The CISO is a party to cyber resilience. I think to me, it's a three-legged stool like many things are. I think it's the business. I think it's IT, and certainly it's cyber resilience, because frequently a vector we do see emerging from the cyberspace.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this topic, and I'm going to say something, Jim, and you tell me if you agree or disagree. We talk about information security. Obviously you got confidentiality, integrity, availability. That'll play into a conversation we're about to have in just a moment. But in many ways, it's very much a proactive discipline, I would say, at least in my mind and in the mind of a lot of people I talk to in business continuity space. Whereas cyber resilience it takes advantage of those proactive or preventative measures, but also ensures that both the business and the technology organizations are in lockstep, continue the business of delivering products and services when the cyber attack, if you will, is ongoing until it can be contained, resolved, and get to return to normal. Am I right about that, or how would you react?
I think that's fair, and you're absolutely right. I mean, if you are reactive and you work in the information security space, you've already lost the battle. When I use a quote from Wayne Gretzky all the time: "We should be skating to where the puck is going to be, not where it's been." Right? That's how we'll be successful. We got to be thinking downrange about what the risks are, and I think we need to overlay that onto the resiliency programs as well. Hey, we have a resiliency program. We built it last year and we tested it. It's awesome. That's nonsense. Okay. Your programs have got to be, your resiliency approach to resiliency has got to be agile. And it's got to be proactive. And I'll use just a quick example. This was in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. So I'm sure everybody's familiar with Change Healthcare and the issues they've had. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, but one of the comments they made was that the adversaries were on the network for at least a week before the attack actually started. Well, of course they were. And this is where we need to think about the threat differently, because the threat actors are far more nimble than I think we historically have been. And we've got to take a step back and say, let's think differently about how we engage in the resiliency discussion.
Well, that sounds great. Now, Jim, one of the things that I really think everyone would benefit hearing your perspective on, I think we're seeing, first of all, business continuity oftentimes reports up to an accountable executive in a lot of different places in different organizations. Sometimes it's common, you might have a chief risk officer in financial services, or might be the CFO right. in a number of organizations. But we're also seeing a growing number of CISOs taking overall accountability for business continuity. And I'm curious, are you seeing that? Are you hearing people talk about that amongst your peers? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I'll take a step back. Throughout my career, in a number of instances, I've actually been certainly the CISO, CSO, Chief Security Officer, and I've owned business continuity. So I think it's been kind of part and parcel because people think about risk and they constantly evolve to, the cyber environment. I think why you're seeing it evolve even more is because, I mean, let's face it, folks, the past probably 5 major resiliency discussions based upon events in across business verticals in the news have all been cyber related, whether it's ransomware, extortionware, or any number of other things. So I think it gravitates to the CISO because, hey, this was a CISO vector, therefore it's your problem, which of course is nonsense. I agree, the vector needs to be managed. So with CISOs, we've got to identify, detect, protect, respond, recover, the standard NIST framework. But once we've done that, we are part of the business. Will help get back to normal. And this is where I think we've got to be careful about it, just defaulting to CISOs. I think we've got a role to play, but I think we don't own it end to end, soup to nuts.
Yeah, because I think one of the conversations I've had with a number of people is that we're seeing a growing number of CISOs who have accountability for business continuity. They're not the sole participant, of course. They're not the sole executive involved in, prevention, response, recovery, so on and so forth. But I think because more and more investment is being triggered by the perception that the number one threat is cyber. I mean, you saw this in the abstract for our presentation. That 56% of executives say cyber is their number one concern or number one concerned risk in 2024. It's not surprising, but I think that trend has been going on for a number of years. And also, I think I'm pretty sure you're going to agree with me on this point, Jim. The CISO is not a predominantly technical person. It is a business executive that happens to be heavily focused on confidentiality, integrity, availability. And that A part is where you start seeing a lot of CISOs kind of gravitating towards, or why business continuity fits. Agree, disagree?
Yeah, I would agree. I would maybe frame it along the same lines. I mean, your role, you're in an executive role, but you have technical acumen. I would say most CISOs have technical acumen, but they're not technologists, not anymore. I mean, my main role, to be very candid, is presenting to the board of directors because they represent, our shareholders, our stockholders, our stakeholders, constituencies, and I need to give them comfort that what we're doing makes sense. And that is absolutely a business function, to your point, Ryan. Absolutely.
Great. Good. So, we talked about at the beginning that we're going to have some informal conversation about what does good look like when it comes to cyber resilience. And so, Jim, I thought maybe we can just kind of talk about this for a second. If maybe you could just share some of your thoughts, maybe it's outcomes related or attributes or characteristics. When an organization is cyber resilient, what are some of those elements that kind of give you a sense that they might be in a pretty good place?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of things that really do extend from just a business continuity program into cyber resiliency, and quite frankly, from cybersecurity as well. First and foremost is you need to identify your key business processes and functions, and then focus on the top 10%. Like, well, if you try and boil the ocean, you're not going to be successful. So what does good look like? It means being pragmatic and prioritizing appropriately. Focus and finish on the top 10%, maybe even 5%. Depending on your business organization. So I think that's number one. I think the second thing is, based upon the results of number one, develop end-to-end plans that think about resiliency, cyber resiliency from a business perspective, certainly from an IT perspective and from a cybersecurity perspective as well. And again, don't be bore-sighted just on cyber. It might be cyber resiliency because, again, the vector frequently lately has been in the cyberspace, but think outside the box. The third thing I would say is test the program to determine efficacy. Hey, we got a program, really? When's the last time you tested it? And I'm not saying it has to be, extremely complex. Hey, we did tabletop. Okay, tabletop means a lot of things to a lot of people. So I don't think it has to be complex, but I think, walk through things like, oh my gosh, we realized when we did our latest, review of our program, some of the phone numbers we had in there actually are for vendors we don't use anymore, or they're outdated. I mean, that may not seem like a big deal. It's a big deal until you have an event, or not. It's not a big deal until you have an event, and it's a really big deal. So I think it's got to be you got to test. I would say part of that is also means that you improve based upon those tests, right? You learn, the constant cycle, the constant ISO cycle, if you will. Share the program with your constituencies. Certainly the ELT, the executive leadership team, and the board. That is for sure. And I'll throw the last thing in, and maybe number 5 is, and I mentioned this earlier, you got to be nimble. Don't think that your plan cannot be static. It's got to be nimble. In my mind, those are not the only, but those are 5 characteristics that I think reflect good from my perspective.
That's great. Now I'm going to unpack a few of those. If I think of my broad, when I think of the broad comment or the broad label, when I'm talking to executives that aren't your role, Jim, but maybe the CEO, CFO, COO, so on and so forth, I think one of the things I've asked is tell me what good looks like in your opinion. When we're way down this path, when we're starting to feel like we're a little bit more mature and we understand roles and responsibilities, strategies, the overarching response or the most common response from CEOs is, I feel confident. I feel confident that we did everything that was within our power to be able to prepare for this. And that if I'm in the throes of a response or in the middle of something bad that's snuck through our defenses, that, I really don't have too many regrets. Yeah, I'm going to learn things all the time, but I did everything I possibly could. And, those after action reviews aren't going to judge me on inaction. That's what I think is good. Now, if you kind of back up from that, you're absolutely right. I think everything that you said, that top 5 list is super important. And number 1, I think the idea of building what I oftentimes call the digital model of the organization, like you said, business processes mapped to IT assets that might be subject to attack so we can understand impact.
Yeah.
What are the controls that are in place that we need to monitor? And obviously, what environments do we need to monitor so we can give ourselves a head start? To, back to the example you used with Change Healthcare, they're in the environment for 5 days. Well, how do we minimize and understand as soon as we have a threat actor inside of the perimeter that we're able to go ahead and begin the response? Of course, that gets into monitoring. You mentioned plans. And I think if we unpack the word plans, that implies the right teams, business and technology, internal and third party, defined roles and responsibilities, and obviously, describing the strategies we'll employ, which include response, recovery, communications, technical, non-technical, recognizing that, when we are subject to an attack that's likely to have downtime, what are the manual processes that we can put in place that business can do while we are, assessing the environment, containing, eradicating, and obviously recovering. So there's a lot to unpack there. But I think if ultimately my take on it, and again, just based on talking to probably now it's hundreds of C-level executives, confidence that I did everything I possibly could and we're positioned to, respond appropriately.
I think confidence is an amazingly accurate descriptor that you would expect from a CEO. And I think it's right. I want to make sure the audience appreciates confidence does not equal perfection, right? Perfect is the enemy of good enough. And if we're trying to achieve perfection, we've lost the battle before it's begun, honestly. What we need to do is demonstrate due diligence. To your point, Brian, that can stand up to the effective level of, after action. Did we do what we said we were going to do? Maybe adjust fire a little bit, but keep in mind, part of that confidence and that demonstration of due diligence by practitioners is going to have to stand up to regulatory scrutiny. And I think we're going to talk about that later, but you need to keep that in mind. I mean, if you've got no objective means to say, we did due care, as an attorney would say, then I think there's going to be a problem.
You bet. So with that being said, now that we've got a chance to talk a little bit about some definitions and some attributes of what good looks like, let's go ahead and open up our third poll, Jeff. And, while you're triggering that, to what level is your organization prioritizing, as Jim and I called it, cyber resilience? And again, please select, the one that makes the most sense here. It's not a priority, only a priority when incidents arise. It's increased priority, or it's consistently been a high priority. So I'm curious which of those 4.
And the answers are coming in. It's actually pretty impressive. C and D puts us at about 80%, actually 90% of the answer. So C is increased priority is about 41%, consistently been high priority, about 50%. So That's from my perspective. I'll be honest. That surprises me. I mean, yeah, I think it's heartening. I'm surprised, but I think it's great to see also.
It's fantastic. So, Jim, one of the things that I think would be interesting, I definitely think the audience would really value hearing about this, is in your conversations with your peers in the C-suite. Oh, and you also mentioned a few moments ago that one of your primary responsibilities is kind of connecting the dots between the organization and the board of directors when it comes to information security and cyber related matters. What are you all talking about? What are people asking you? What are you finding that you're focusing your communications on in terms of status, risk, so on and so forth? Can you just talk about that for a bit?
Sure. And I think, and I want to make a distinction. I think CISOs do present to the full board. I do. But regularly we present to the audit committee, which is a subset. But keep in mind, there's still members of the board, right? So it's not, I'm not demeaning in any way. It's the audit committee. The audit committee is part of the board. And I will tell you that for an audit committee, you know, I'll say number one, it's cyber. Does cyber come up? You better believe it comes up. Is it always on the agenda? Absolutely, without a doubt, yes. I would say one of the things that they'll ask about is, tell me about current incidents within our company, because they want to know the good, bad, and the ugly, but also globally. What's happening that we need to be concerned about? I can tell you, I'm at Kimberly-Clark, we're CPG, consumer packaged goods, and recent events have happened across the CPG space that I can tell you, your board members read the Wall Street Journal. They're paying attention. And the Wall Street Journal has typically on the front page something on cyber every single day. Actually, today, the front page news was the fact that Palo Alto is acquiring IBM's QRadar from a security analytics perspective. So they read the Wall Street Journal, they pay attention. So you need to be prepared to discuss about current incidents, not only within your company, but I'll say globally across industry verticals. They're going to ask questions like, what is our risk appetite? And this starts, this I think is your question, Brian. This starts to merge between what's the risk appetite from a cyber perspective, but also from a resiliency perspective. And where do those two intersect? If we're not on the same plane, we probably have a problem. And that gets down to, what is the status of our major unmitigated risks? Therefore, what are the gaps? Boards do ask those questions. And they do want to know how we compare, we being whatever company it is, how we compare across industry verticals. They want certainly within the industry vertical, but across industry verticals. And then number 5, based upon those first 4 kind of thoughts and themes, is what investment needs to be made. If the gaps are gaps that they do not feel are reasonable, they're going to ask the question, what investments do we need to make?
So you mentioned risk appetite. What's a tangible example of that? Like when you're having that conversation, what are elements of that? Is it financial? Is it effect on the customer? How do you communicate that, or what's that conversation look like with a board member?
Yeah, I think it's all of those that you just mentioned. Certainly, if, for example, if we're manufacturing, if we've not considered our largest mill in the equation, the question is going to be, you got to get me. I mean, how can we not accept the resiliency program for our largest mill, as an example? Equally, maybe it's our smallest mill, but it's the only mill that produces a single product. Therefore, you have product, resiliency and considerations, because it becomes a priority. May not be your highest money earner, but if it's one of your top products, then you need to think about that. So I think it's a tough question to answer, because I think it's relative, but certainly boards think across, what is acceptable risk. They will, if they see something that doesn't make sense, they're going to push back. And I think a lot of that comes out. So our enterprise risk management, many of them will present to the board at least once a year. And they're going to push back on saying, wait a minute, I see your top 20 risk and I see your resiliency, but what about X, Y, and Z? So board members are actually pretty savvy and they're pretty looped in as to what's going on. And if they see something that isn't aligned with how they understand the business, they're going to ask why it's not a priority. That was kind of a long-winded answer, but that's how boards approach it.
No, that's great. And what about a trend that I've seen over the last, I'll say 12 to 24 months, is conversations between the C-suite and boards regarding the board's role in a cyber situation. Have you had those kind of conversations? Are you hearing others have them? And what does that look like in terms of expectations?
I'm sorry, can you say it one more time, Ryan?
Yeah, conversations regarding the board of directors asking CISO, CEO, hey, what should our role be in a cyber resilience effort? What's that conversation look like?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that's an evolving question, to be candid. I think board members have only in the last couple of years really started to find their sweet spot as to what the responsibility is around cyber. Now they're saying, wow, they take the blinders off and it's like, okay, you got cyber, then you got resiliency, you got enterprise risk management. How am I thinking about this? And I think more and more you're seeing boards say, should we be part of the solution, or are we simply informed? Should we be exercising a tabletop at the very executive level, as an example? That's definitely something that we're seeing at the board level, for sure. They are definitely, the board, I will tell you, just from my perspective, the boards today versus the boards 2 or even 3 years ago are far more switched on with respect to cyber and resiliency related activities, far more. And I think it's because part of it's because they realize the winds are changing, but part of it is the regulatory environment is driving it. Boards are now being held accountable to be looped into these things.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's interesting, if we said what does good look like? Well, I think one of the attributes of bad is if you're having a conversation with the board about their role during, for example, the response or recovery effort during a response and recovery effort for the first time, that's bad. That's just creating inefficiency and obviously a distraction.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the challenges is, boards, I think, want to be engaged, but I think sometimes it's like, okay, arm's length engaged.
Yeah.
And if you push them a little bit further, there may be a level of discomfort, but that's up to us as again, practitioners to say, I understand this is not your necessarily your sweet spot, but we need to have you more informed as to what we do, why we do it, and what your role needs to be. Because if it's something like, for example, a ransomware attack or cryptojacking or extortionware, depending on what the response is from the company, it may require board sign off, right? Yep. And that's where the board, to your point, they shouldn't be learning about that in the actual event.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about in terms of just overall, issues and misperceptions for a few moments here. So, what's your take on kind of what's tripping up organizations commonly when it comes to cyber resilience? Again, whether it's, your personal experience or some of the conversations and engagement with some of your peers, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I think some of this is what we've already talked about, to be candid. I think first and foremost, I think the number one trip up is, well, it's a CISO cybersecurity team responsibility. And then there's a little bit of this, people, that's a problem. I think that's the biggest trip up. And I actually recently had to, I'll say, inform, resiliency, business continuity, cyber resiliency, cybersecurity are team sports. They're not the domain of a person or a group. That is a fact. So I think I recently have brought together a couple of executives to say, as an example, hey, you pinged me about this external incident. And they're like, hey, what are we doing about it? I'm like, hang on. I said, I'll tell you what I'm doing about it. I said, but now we need to talk about what you're doing about it. And it was kind of an eye opener. And the good news is we've got some pretty self-reflective executives that said, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what trips it up is focus on cyber, focus on the CISO, not on the business and on the IT piece. And I think that's the first, and that becomes a problem. And I think that lens is, so focusing is a CISO responsibility. And then number two is you're not thinking about the bigger picture around IT and the business, I think is a second thing that trips it up. The third thing, and we've talked a little bit about this, I maintain are static plans. Plans that are not nimble and do not reflect reality of the changing landscape around cyber resiliency, I think is a problem. I think a lack of a validation of the efficacy of the plan is a problem. I mean, saying I've got a plan and putting it on a shelf behind me where it collects dust is not a plan, right? It's not a plan at all. Yep. The last thing I'll say, and I'll be parochial, speaking as a CISO, is the evolving threat vector. A lot of malicious actors are very sophisticated now. And so again, let's refer to change. They were on the network for 5 days at least. By the way, I'll bet you it was a lot longer than that, but they're publishing a week prior to the actual attack. Well, they weren't just sitting around doing nothing. They were doing reconnaissance. They were scanning the network. They were reading email messages. They were understanding what your resiliency plans look like, so they can bypass some of the controls you put in place. And that's one of the other things. I think you need to assume that at least part of your resiliency plan has been compromised. Back to being nimble. How are you going to react to that? And I think that threat actors today are far, far, far more sophisticated than they were 2 to 3 years ago. And a lot of them are nation state, but not all of them, certainly.
Absolutely. And so just let me add a couple things to this. And I think we're covering both this slide and performance and misperceptions at the same time. So I'll just go to the next slide to cover off on this. But no doubt those that, when I think executives identify that they have that kind of that sneaking suspicion they're not doing very well, oftentimes it's because they're heavily focused on the tech only element of it rather than the broader business implications. I think they're also get nervous about when they're not having conversations in advance, oftentimes during exercises on some of the more thorny topics. Great example is, how are we making a decision on if we had to pay a ransom, would we do it? And is that, what does that look like? What's the criteria? Are we all on the same page? Is it always no, or is it potentially yes? And what goes into that? I think there's another one, and this is one that I think usually upsets or causes a little bit of consternation when it comes to business continuity professionals, is the idea that we sometimes have different downtime tolerances or requirements for a cyber event versus some other form of disruption. And what I find always incredibly interesting there is that, I don't think we usually cover downtime tolerance on a threat basis. It's usually the pain we're not willing to tolerate above and beyond a certain time or performance level. How does that change based on a threat? And many people say, well, I lose control of a situation in a cyber event. I got to wait on forensics. I got to do all these things. But the reality is you can still engineer potentially different strategies for different types of threats. And I think that's a key that I think needs to be thought about, is that, we might have different strategies that aren't the traditional, hey, I lost my data center, I got to recover somewhere else. It's not things like that. I also think that there is a big change in terms of the higher level performance organizations are testing and practicing more frequently. I'm seeing C-suite, CEOs saying, we used to check the box with a once a year exercise. I want to do this until I get confident. And if that means we have to do it quarterly or monthly, let's do it, because we're incredibly vulnerable at this time. I also think there's an issue where we sometimes see different response structures for cyber versus other threats. And it's true that, yes, you might have maybe an additional team or two, like a CSIRT team that is working the technical issues. But if you have a totally different broad strategic crisis management process for cyber versus other things, I think you risk creating some confusion and some performance issues as you're triggering your overall response. And so that's a bit of an issue as well. But I do agree with you, Jim, like whether it's, when it comes to practice and practicing more frequently, practicing agility, the conceptual skills, that's so essential in this specific threat scenario, that being cyber.
Yeah, I think that's right. Absolutely.
So let's do our fourth and final poll at this point. And, Jim and I just got done talking quite a bit about exercising and the like. And, I mentioned that we're going to do some conclusions and kind of do a summary of key considerations and key capabilities. But let's talk about this one for a moment. When was your last cyber exercise? And notice we didn't cover it off on technical versus business, but let's just talk about it this way. Within the last 6 months, within the last 12 months, more than a year ago, I don't know, or maybe we didn't do it, or it's not applicable.
Yeah, and so for right now, it looks like the majority, 60%, have been within the last 6 months. And then it's spread a little bit evenly between the last 12 months or maybe more than a year ago. And Brian, I just want to comment, again, I'm being parochial from a CISA perspective. I would say we exercise the incident response plan around cyber events all the time, because we have real world events all the time, which that's not unique to Kimberly-Clark. It's across industry verticals. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a great point that we have to ask ourselves the question is, what's the expectation Is it a tactical cyber exercise? Is it operational? Is it strategic? And those mean very different things to very different people. And I think there's got to be, I think you made the comment just a moment ago, there's got to be clarity and I'll say harmonization across different groups about what the expectation really is.
You bet. All right. So I mentioned, it's going to be a little bit more of a meaty set of conclusions to kind of give everybody a little bit of a takeaway, broken down by key considerations and key capabilities. Just to recap some of what Jim and I talked about, and we might add a few additional items here as we go through. But, number one, let's talk about key considerations. Number one, and this is not unlike so many other topics related to business continuity, is that when something happens, do we have the right roles and responsibilities, the right people with the right skills and experiences? Do we have primaries and alternatives? And again, does this align to the culture of the organization? And again, that is both business and technical. It's security and technical. It's all of the right people that are going to come together to address a situation that exceeds the normal kind of business as usual span of control. And I think that's, certainly important. And it's also, do we have the discipline to rely on those roles and responsibilities, not just in an exercise, but in a real event? And so that's a broad grouping of number one, probably not a surprise based on the audience that we have today. Number two, do we have good triggers and activation criteria for different teams, for different roles and responsibilities? Jim's comment a moment ago about, practicing and handling incidents is very, very commonplace. It may not become this enterprise impactful situation, but the key here is how do we, what are the triggers for, again, exceeding business as usual, getting perhaps the right people together, even if it's just a simmering issue that likely can be controlled and contained. And so I think we get into a series of, yes, downtime tolerances that are threat agnostic. We're thinking about potentially activation triggers around the most prioritized products and services or business services. And maybe there are triggers specific to different types of severe yet plausible scenarios. And I think, again, organizations are kind of looking at those all a little bit differently. Are we integrating cyber with, again, existing crisis management and crisis communications capabilities? Again, not reinventing the wheel just for this specific threat vector, but being able to go ahead and rely on proven capabilities that perhaps we used during the pandemic, during natural disasters, so on and so forth. Do you have the right procedures? Now, again, I'm not one to, like Jim, he and I share the same approach on this, is that you oftentimes see plans as evidence that planning took place. It oftentimes is there because it's capturing things that are very difficult to memorize, but it also can be a quick reference and a reminder not to skip a critical process that's necessary to be able to manage the risk appropriately. And so having core procedures that can be referenced around, how do we prepare? How do we identify? How do we contain the situation, eradicate and recover? And by the way, that sounds super technical, but the reality is there's business elements associated with that as well. Because again, as certain activities are taking place technically, the business is going to be either subject to some issue or they have an opportunity to prepare for something that could escalate in a much greater manner. And so that's why I think it's interesting to have some maybe unique playbooks for this, but it doesn't mean that you're replacing the entirety of your response and recovery process just for cyber. And then I think the last key consideration, and then I'll ask Jim to kind of give his reaction to some of the things that I said, is that, cyber is incredibly interesting in terms of the need to rely on third parties, experts as it relates to forensics, engagement with your cyber insurance program, potentially engaging outside counsel that lives this day in and day out with their clients. And not only just knowing who they are and having their contact information, but readily staying engaged with them, sharing process information, and even exercising, testing, practicing together. More and more, I'm seeing specialized outside counsels join and be a key part of cyber response efforts at the senior leadership level. And so some of these are the key considerations. And again, I'm going to unpack the capabilities here in the next two slides. But Jim, before I go there, Any reaction, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I love it. I'm going to talk to bullet point 1 and bullet point 5. Bullet point 1, don't be dismissive of this one, because I'm going to give you an example. I'll just say in a prior life, a real world example where we identified a vector that occurred in one of our remote locations. I recommend that we shut that location off. You know, as a surgeon would say, you know, you cut off the hand to save the arm or save the patient. And basically, I was overruled. And I'm not trying to overspill milk. What I'm saying is we have to be clear on, if you've identified what could be a vector for a cyber resiliency related event, who's got the authority to say shut that down so it doesn't impact the entire business? That is a significant role, and that's not more of, hey, who's running the AFDS, you know, environment. No. I'm talking about major strategic moves. You have to be very clear, because if you shut down a particular plant, you don't have the authority, there's going to be significant ramifications for that. So just keep that in mind. That's not a small thing. And I think that's really, really, I'm glad you put that first, Brian, because I think it's significant. The last thing I'll say is third-party information. I'm just going to call it third-party for a moment. We are increasingly seeing, I'll say in the order of magnitude of at least 50% of all incidents that require some level of cyber resiliency to have originated with a third party that was introduced into your environment. That's what I'm going to call it, just third party at large. Do not underestimate that. So you think you're buttoned up. If you have not asked the question of your third parties, if they're buttoned up, they're the weakest link, depending on their connectivity to your environment, which is probably a lot more than people realize.
How much time do you spend asking about if they're buttoned up versus maybe even sharing some of the things that you found to work? Is it becoming more consultative, or is it just more of like, you know, inquiry based?
I would say it is inquiry based. And I'll just say, you know, non-attributionally, with the ability to write to audit. And if there's something that looks untoward, the ability to take a more direct approach to helping that third party become compliant.
Makes sense. All right, well, let's flip the script a little bit here and talk about some capabilities. And there's 2 slides here, everybody. So I'm going to walk through both of them, and then I'm going to ask Jim to comment after the second. And if I have to go back, I can certainly do that. This is not necessarily in any particular order, but I think when I've reflected on key capabilities and through my conversations with CISOs in general, or leadership teams, or those that are kind of on the front lines of you know, monitoring, response, recovery, this is kind of some of the common elements. And I think the first one is, well, just communications. I called it out-of-band communications, and that's because there's obviously many different cyber related scenarios that have the ability to affect communications. Jim used the one before about, you know, threat actors being in an environment so that they can monitor your communications. They may not be shut off, but they may be compromised. So how do you have out-of-band communications that allow you to be able to coordinate without being observed, or alternate communications because your primaries are unavailable? And that's with both internal and external parties. The ability, you know, tools that help give you a sense of, is there unusual activity taking place? Is there people in our environment? Or how are we getting alerted both internally and from third parties that may be monitoring? Give us as much advance notice as possible. That's huge. The forensic and containment activities. It depends on the size of the organization. Some smaller organizations may have to rely on third parties, have them on retainer that can be quickly brought in to assess and contain and eventually eradicate. Other larger organizations may have those core capabilities internally, but if they do, are they practicing those? And are they tied into the broader effort? Another one is, and again, we talked about cyber insurance just a few moments ago, but understanding and how to notify, you know, what are the rules of the road, so to speak, in terms of taking action so as not to compromise your insurability. Understand what the insurance provider potentially can introduce and provide to you to assist with a response, and being able to practice that. And that's that's important too. And there's oftentimes a relationship to being able to provide discounted or expert recommendations on outside counsel. And it's just amazing to me. There's this whole cottage industry of legal resources that are just focused on this. And they go so far as to be able to even have capabilities to pay ransoms on your behalf. And so it's incredibly interesting having them involved also, especially during exercises, brings their expertise to bear. It's a great learning and awareness opportunity, but more importantly, having them there allows you to practice the way you'd actually play, and that's huge. Engagement of PR firms, just like outside counsel specializing in cyber-related issues, there are PR firms that do the same. And again, depending on the skills you have internally, this might be a key resource to be able to communicate externally with a wide range of stakeholders, including government and regulatory agencies. And then there's social media monitoring. If, again, as Jim said, he and I share the same habit, if you will, of reading the Wall Street Journal every day. And when you see things that are, front page or maybe buried in the front, the main section there, you're seeing things that not only they may be true, but they may be false. But also that's the traditional media, but all of the noise on social media as well. How do you monitor that? How do you understand if there's trends and for the things that are inaccurate, how do you go ahead and get ahead of being able to correct those before they spiral out of control? And so again, I think that's pretty important to be, keeping in mind. There's the conversations in advance of a cyber attack around, do we and when do we notify law enforcement? And of course, that could be very much based on industry. It could be based on geography, country, you name it, in terms of the kind of the rules of the road. But understanding what those are and being on the same page between your leadership team and your general counsel, outside counsel, very important. Depending on who you are and what's been affected, being able to understand how you can do notifications, but also providing certain resources to an individual to make them a little bit more comfortable on things like credit monitoring and the like. Sounds tactical, but again, having a good game plan there is important. And again, it goes with the third bullet there too. Notification of law enforcement is one thing, but also your government agencies and regulatory bodies. There's a growing body of expectations regarding the timeliness of notification, especially within the financial services and healthcare spaces. And so understanding what those are and practicing them is key. And then, of course, being able to understand what are the different strategies you have in place, both business and technical, to be able to navigate while the IT organization and while the information security organizations are, again, containing, eradicating everything. And then from a business continuity perspective, what are the viable manual workarounds and contingencies that could be employed? Do we have the proper data backups to be able to minimize how far back in time? Do we have failover capabilities, but are they really isolated and not subject to the same attack? You hear things like air-gapped backups and all kinds of very technical sounding solutions. Some of those are very, very different than our traditional disaster recovery capabilities. Have we had conversations about that? And where do we have some gap analysis to think about? And then, of course, notifications to all other third parties, especially customers. So back to Jim's point on 2 slides ago, when we're talking about third parties as a source, well, what happens to be if you are that third party that's the source to get ahead of your business partners? So Jim, reactions on the last 2 slides?
Yeah, there's 3 things I want to highlight. First and foremost, and I'm going to say non-attributional to Jim Kastle, but so for your cybersecurity teams, there can be a sub 1, sub 2. Those are normally your highest severity instance. Maybe even those are sub 3. You need to have an attorney from your company included in all communications related to those events, because when you do that, it's marked attorney-client privilege, which gives you some protection, right? I'm just going to leave it at that. I'll let you talk to your attorneys to figure out what that means. The second theme around social media. So Kimberly-Clark, I'll use Kimberly-Clark as an example. We're a branded company. We've got $5 billion brands that each individually produce $1 billion in revenue. We've got 3 more that are on the cusp of being $1 billion brands. So we are a branded company. We care a lot if we see something on social media that is undermining one of those brands, because it takes years and years and decades, in fact, to build up a brand and moments to destroy it. So we care a lot about social media monitoring from a corporate perspective, and certainly from a cyber perspective. The last thing I'll say is about the regulatory comments Brian has made on this slide. So many of our companies are SEC registrants, so we're subject to SEC guidelines. Some are critical infrastructure, you're subject to DHS guidelines. And I'm sure if you've read the Wall Street Journal about 3 weeks ago, the FTC, don't ask me how, announced that they're pursuing MGM and their breach and how the cyber event happened. So I'm pretty sure FTC is not a cyber agency, but yet they're in the game. Here's my point. Back to use the word earlier, they're not harmonized. For SEC, you have 4 days. For DHS, if you're a critical infrastructure, you have 3 days. And if you're MGM and out of the blue comes the FTC, maybe you have 0 days, right? So keep those themes in mind because I think they're very, very relevant. I think these 2 slides are probably the money slides for the entire presentation.
But I might disagree with you there. I think this is probably the money, just the comments I think that you need to make here. And since we have a lot of people that are business continuity professionals on this call, can you give some advice from a CISO perspective on these 2 questions?
Yeah, I can actually. And Brian and I did talk about these, but I forgot these questions were coming. But I've got some. I think I've got reasonable answers from my perspective. Number 1, don't think like a business continuity professional. Stop it. Think outside the box. Think like a business person and a business person that understands end-to-end processes. And I'm not saying business continuity professionals don't necessarily do that. What I'm saying is the game has changed in the event of and with the advent of the need to be cyber resilient. So think differently. And I think that's a big part of the cyber resilience capability is practitioners are part of the solution. I think that is huge. I think practitioners, and I'm going to say business continuity practitioners with the focus on resiliency can be really, the question here is about creation. I think you can be the creation, but I think you can be the leading edge to make sure that it's receives the right level of attention within your companies. I cannot stress that enough. So think differently and be part of the solution. I know everybody on this call can certainly do that. The second point really ties in with the first point. Engage with the CISO. CISOs have a lot of experience with the resiliency because we deal with these things typically actually every day. More tactical and frequently they're just shunned and they're non-events because you manage it at the firewall level as an example. But do engage with the CISO because if it's in the cyber resiliency situation where the vector was cyber, the CISO is going to be your best friend, okay? Because you're both working to understand the problem, obviously identify it, contain it, remediate it, and then work across the IT and business environments to ensure the proper resiliency. So I would say engage the business at large, but the CISO deals with this stuff on a daily basis. So definitely engage the CISO.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jim. All right. Well, we got a couple of minutes left. I was looking at the chat and there were 2 related questions, Jim. I thought maybe we can cover these just so everybody else is aware. Feel free to put more questions in the chat. Feel free, and because we're not going to get to all of them, we promise a response offline to all of you. So please recognize that we will get back to you on that. Jim, one that I thought was to you, one to me, they're related. Jim, if you could request one thing from your business continuity program manager, what would it be?
I would be it's similar to what I said with point 1 a moment ago on that slide. I think the business continuity leader needs to think differently about business continuity and think differently in terms of cyber resiliency. I think they're certainly related, but they're different. I'd say business continuity is overarching. Cyber resiliency is more of operational. How are we going to get back to turning out operations widgets within our respective companies? I think recognize that they are not necessarily the bastion of all information, but also recognize that we respect their position and think of it as a 2-way street. I think sometimes that gets a little bit lost in the shuffle. And I'm not disparaging business continuity professionals, but again, I think the landscape has changed so much. I think it necessitates the need for practitioners to think a little bit differently about their role.
Makes sense. And then the one that I got was Brian, having worked with CISOs as a program sponsor and other C-level executives, what's different about the CISO? Any cautions? Here's the interesting thing to me about this one. And I'm going to comment on this from those that are, maybe didn't have a relationship with before or have come to maybe asking for some advice on how to get started or how to think about this differently. CISOs, I think sometimes recognizing that they are coming at it first and foremost from a cyber threat perspective, helping them make sure we're on the same page, that it's a business and technology issue, primarily a business issue first, but need to work together. Not, oftentimes they'll come in guns blazing. wanting to build process and so on and so forth, cautioning them that there might be capabilities already in place, leverage those. It's not like throw everything out and start over, that type of thing. But also reminding them that as they're solving for, especially if they're really just bent on focusing on that cyber issue, reminding them that the investment they're making now on this specific topic can be parlayed into focusing on other threats, and positioning them as to be positioning them to be able to solve the broader or availability regardless of threat vector. So that's kind of how I would do it.
I love it. There's a few questions in here. We'll make sure these get packaged up and sent to myself and or Brian so we can respond to them. I think there's some good questions that we're happy to engage in.
Yep. Thank you. And thank you, Jim, for being here today. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Here's our contact information if you want to reach out to either one of us offline. And again, really appreciate the engagement. Thanks for participating in the polls. Presentation will come out, and really hope you have a great day, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.